quartermaster pointed with his thumb to the woman standing by his side. She was 27, perhaps, plump, and, in a coarse fashion, pretty. She wore a white dress and a large white hat. Her fat calves in white cotton stockings bulged over the tops of long white boots in glacé kid. She gave MacPhail an ingratiating smile. "The feller's trying to soak me $1.50 a day for the meanest sized room," she said, in a hoarse voice. "I tell you, she's a friend of mine, Joe," said the quartermaster. "She can't pay more than $1, and you've sure got to take her for that." The trader was fat and smooth and quietly smiling. "Well, if you put it like that, Mr. Swan, I'll see what I can do about it. I'll talk to Mrs. Horn, and if we think we can make a reduction, we will." "Don't try to pull that stuff with me," said Miss Thompson. "We'll settle this right now. You get $1 a day for the room, and not one bean more." Dr. Macphail smiled. He admired the effrontery with which she bargained. He was the sort of man who had always paid what he was asked. He preferred to be overcharged than to haggle. The trader sighed. "Well, to oblige Mr. Swan, I'll take it." "That's the goods," said Miss Thompson. "Come right in and have a shot of hooch. I've got some real good rye in that grip if you'll bring it along, Mr. Swan. You come along too, Doctor." "Oh, I don't think I will, thank you," he answered. "I'm just going down to see that our luggage is all right." He stepped out into the rain. It swept in from the opening of the harbor in sheets, and the opposite shore was all blurred. He passed 2 or 3 natives clad in nothing but the lava, with huge umbrellas over them. They walked finely, with leisurely movements, very upright, and they smiled and greeted him in a strange tongue as they went by. It was nearly dinner time when he got back, and their meal was laid in the trader's parlor. It was a room designed not to live in, but for purposes of prestige, and it had a musty, melancholy air. A suite of stamped plush was arranged neatly round the walls, and from the middle of the ceiling, protected from the flies by yellow tissue paper, hung a gilt chandelier. Davidson did not come. "I know he went to call on the governor," said Mrs. Davidson, "and I guess he's kept him to dinner." A little native girl brought them a dish of Hamburger steak, and after a while the trader came up to see that they had everything they wanted. "I see we have a fellow lodger, Mr. Horn," said Dr. Macphail. "She's taken a room, that's all," answered the trader. "She's getting her own board." He looked at the 2 ladies with an obsequious air. "I put her downstairs so she shouldn't be in the way. She won't be any trouble to you." "Is it someone who was on the boat?" asked Mrs. Macphail. "Yes, ma'am. She was in the second cabin. She was going to Apia. She had a position as a cashier waiting for her." "Oh!" When the trader was gone, Macphail said, "I shouldn't think she'd find it exactly cheerful having her meals in her room." "If she was in the second cabin, I guess she'd rather," answered Mrs. Davidson. "I don't exactly know who it can be." "I happened to be there when the quartermaster brought her along. Her name's Thompson." "It's not the woman who was dancing with the quartermaster last night?" asked Mrs. Davidson. "That's who it must be," said Mrs. Macphail. "I wondered at the time what she was. She looked rather fast to me." "Not a good style at all," said Mrs. Davidson. They began to talk of other things, and after dinner, tired with their early rise, they separated and slept. When they awoke, though the sky was still gray and the clouds hung low, it was not raining, and they went for a walk on the high road which the Americans had built along the bay. On their return, they found that Davidson had just come in. "We may be here for a fortnight," he said irritably. "I've argued it out with the governor, but he says there is nothing to be done." "Mr. Davidson's just longing to get back to his work," said his wife, with an anxious glance at him. "We've been away for a year." he said, walking up and down the veranda. "The mission has been in charge of native missionaries, and I'm terribly nervous that they've let things slide. They're good men. I'm not saying a word against them. God-fearing, devout, and truly Christian men. Their Christianity would put many so-called Christians at home to blush. But they're pitifully lacking in energy. They can make a stand once. They can make a stand twice, but they can't make a stand all the time. If you leave a mission in charge of a native missionary, no matter how trustworthy he seems, in course of time you'll find he's let abuses creep in." Mr Davidson stood still. With his tall, spare form and his great eyes flashing out of his pale face, he was an impressive figure. His sincerity was obvious in the fire of his gestures and in his deep, ringing voice. "I expect to have my work cut out for me. I shall act, and I shall act promptly. If the tree is rotten, it shall be cut down and cast into the flames." And in the evening, after the high tea, which was their last meal, while they sat in the stiff parlour, the ladies working and Dr Macphail smoking his pipe, the missionary told them of his work in the islands. "When we went there, they had no sense of sin at all," he said. "They broke the commandments one after the other, and never knew they were doing wrong. And I think that was the most difficult part of my work, to instil into the natives the sense of sin." The Macphails knew already that Davidson had worked in the Solomons for 5 years before he met his wife. She had been a missionary in China, and they had become acquainted in Boston, where they were both spending part of their leave to attend a missionary congress. On their marriage they had been appointed to the islands, in which they had laboured ever since. In the course of all the conversations they had had with Mr Davidson, one thing had shone out clearly, and that was the man's unflinching courage. He was a medical missionary, and he was liable to be called at any time to one or another of the islands in the group. Even the whaleboat is not so very safe a conveyance in the stormy Pacific of the wet season, but often he would be sent for in a canoe, and the danger was great. In cases of illness or accident he never hesitated. A dozen times he had spent the whole night bailing for his life, and more than once Mrs Davidson had given him up for lost. "I'd beg him not to go sometimes," she said, "or at least to wait till the weather was more settled, but he'd never listen. He's obstinate, and when he's once made up his mind, nothing can move him." "How can I ask the natives to put their trust in the Lord if I am afraid to do so myself?" cried Davidson. "And I'm not. They know that if they send for me in their trouble, I'll come if it's humanly possible. And do you think the Lord is going to abandon me when I am on His business? The wind blows at His bidding, and the waves toss and rage at His word." Dr Macphail was a timid man. He had never been able to get used to the hurtling of the shells over the trenches, and when he was operating in an advanced dressing station the sweat poured from his brow and dimmed his spectacles in the effort he made to control his unsteady hand. He shuddered a little as he looked at the missionary. "I wish I could say that I've never been afraid," he said. "I wish you could say that you believed in God," retorted the other. But for some reason, that evening, the missionary's thoughts travelled back to the early days he and his wife had spent on the islands. Sometimes Mrs Davidson and I would look at one another, and the tears would stream down our cheeks. We worked without ceasing, day and night, and we seemed to make no progress. I don't know what I should have done without her then. When I felt my heart sink, when I was very near despair, she gave me courage and hope." Mrs Davidson looked down at her work, and a slight colour rose to her thin cheeks. Her hands trembled a little. She did not trust herself to speak. "We had no one to help us. We were alone, thousands of miles from any of our own people, surrounded by darkness. When I was broken and weary she would put her work aside and